I call to order the meeting of the Regulating and Taxing Cultivation, Manufacture, and Commercial Sale of Marijuana in Anchorage for Thursday, June 25th. We're going to go through our typical reports and give each department a chance to update us. But our main focus today is going to be on land use and licensing, particularly now that the second part of regulations have been put up for public testimony from the state of Alaska. And the reason that we're going to really focus on this land use process is we're trying to determine as a municipality which is going to come first, the chicken or the egg. And I'll explain that to you. On February 24th, individuals will be able to apply to the state of Alaska for a license for marijuana sale, grow, operations. And we will get into a little bit of that here in a moment. Now I'll expand on that. But what I want to do first is begin by going around and doing introductions. And I believe I saw the municipal attorney, new municipal attorney is Bill. Okay, fine. He'll be joining us. But let's begin with you, Todd. We'll go around and do introductions to those at the head table.
Todd Sherwood, Assistant Municipal Attorney.
Erica McConnell, Planning Department. Amanda Moser, Deputy Clerk, Clerk's Office.
Mandy Honest, Business License Official, Clerk's Office.
Karen Wells, Acting Deputy Director of Development Services and Building Official.
Bruce Schulte, I'm an unofficial member of this committee and recently appointed to the state's Marijuana Control Board.
Ernie Hall, Anchorage Assembly.
Pete Peterson, Assembly.
Amy Domboski, Assembly.
Julia Tucker, Assembly Counsel. Jody Davis, Chief Assistant Municipal Prosecutor.
I'm Kirsty White. I'm in Exeter Prosecutor's Office.
And we will be joined shortly by Bill Falsey. He is the new municipal attorney, and we're going to give him an opportunity to share his thoughts with us as a new guy in the game. But going back to what I was referring to, so when you apply for that license from the state, we're trying to come up with an idea here. At one point, we were under the understanding when you applied to the state of Alaska for a license, you had to give the location of where your business operation was going to be. And we're trying to figure out how we manage that, because if it does, then we would be looking at maybe November, December, looking at land use or conditional use permitting, so that you would begin that process here, maybe move through that so that when you did go to the state to apply for a license, if a location is required, you would have a location that has been through the process here, and you may have, be able to know that you're going to be able to get a land use. Because if you go to the state and get a permit with 2510 C Street on it, and then you come to the municipality, and then we go through the land use or conditional use permit, if that's declined by the municipality, then now you've got a license that's got a date or a location on it that's not going to be valid. So that's where I'm saying chicken or the egg, which comes first, because we've got a process here, and that's what we're going to discuss is the land use permit process and the conditional use permit process as we get later into the meeting. And that is essentially my report. I don't see Lieutenant Casey from the police department. If he joins us later, we'll move back to them. The State of Alaska Alcohol Beverage Control Board, Cindy is out of country and was not able to be here. And Sarah was not comfortable doing it because she's not the actual spokesperson for the Marijuana Control Board. So what she did was shared an email with us that was available out there for everyone to pick up a copy. And it kind of brings you up to current status of where the Marijuana Control Board is. And as Bruce pointed out earlier, he has been appointed to the board, and I've asked that unless the state tells him he's got a conflict, I'd really like for him to continue ex officio on our board because being ex officio, he doesn't have a vote to influence anything that we do in regards to marijuana. But I would encourage all of you to pick up a copy of this, and at your leisure, please read it. So with that, we will move into the legal department, and we'll begin with you, Mr. Falcius. You're the new municipal attorney, and I'm sure you're totally up to speed on this because we need a leader. So the floor is yours for comment, and then, of course, Todd has handed out some stuff, and I'm sure that you'll want him to follow up with what happened.
Well, thank you, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate the invitation to start plugging into the work of this subcommittee. I will say the work has been able to great so far at the staff level by Todd Sherwood and Seneca Pino. Seneca is out of the office today, so we're able to hosted by Jody, and I look forward to working hand in glove with this subcommittee going forward.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Mr. Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just from kind of legal department standpoint and what we're up to, Jody may well want to speak to this, but the main thing that has happened recently, 4 ordinances that were drafted in the criminal division introduced to the assembly, as you know, July 14th, public hearing date was set for 25 August to give time for the Public Safety Committee to review those 4. Really not too much more to say about them unless Julie wants to briefly describe the 4, but they're out there for public consideration. And then I was going to talk just a little bit about the state regulation process, unless there are any comments or questions on those 4 ordinances.
Anyone on the committee? Appears not.
So the other thing that we've been staying engaged with is the state's draft regulation process. And I put 2 sheets out at your places, and they look awfully similar. One says supplemental notice of proposed regulations at the top, and then you'll see down where there's a number 1, it says local option regulations are proposed as follows. Last time we discussed this a little bit, and this is just, they had initially released this as set 1 of their proposed regulations for comment. They ended up having to renotice it, and I'll briefly describe the difference. It doesn't affect us, but in the initial set, it all dealt with local option and how you can opt out of various aspects or all aspects of commercial marijuana operations. They had in the initial set chose to include established villages, which would be villages typically in the bush that are not even a Class 2 city or a Class 1 city, for example, or home rule or any of those. They have no formal government. They may be recognized as tribal villages, but that's it. And under Alcohol Title IV, which was passed by the legislature, they of course have local option for that. Apparently, one of the state attorneys, after the initial release of the regulations, talked to the ABC board and said, "We've gone beyond what 1738, what ballot measure 2 said you could do, because it talked about local option only with regard to local government, and established village doesn't affect or doesn't come within that definition." So it's something the legislature will have to take care of. Like I said, we don't have established villages within municipalities, so it's really not an issue for us, but that's the reason they re-released it. And it's extended the comment period, so we will submit our comments again to make sure they're in there. But from what I've seen so far, otherwise there aren't any differences in that. The second set, which just says notice of proposed regulations at the top, has Article 1, licensing fees and regulations, Article 2, marijuana retail store regulations, and Article 7, operating requirements for all marijuana establishments. I won't try to go over these, but there's 3 paragraph descriptors. I haven't read through it in detail yet. Probably one of the areas that's going to be of most significant interest to us from a local government standpoint is in Article 1, because it deals with protesting licenses and local input, and I think most of us are familiar with how that works in the alcohol setting, and I would anticipate it will be similar in the marijuana setting. And overall, as I've talked about before, we'll be especially looking to be sure that there are ample ways that we can participate from a local government standpoint, and then looking further down the road, even though we may say we're mostly satisfied with the state regulations, are there areas where we may want to plug in with local ordinances further down the road once these get established? But something I would just emphasize overall again, and I think we know this, but the one bill that the legislature got passed set up the Marijuana Control Board. Other bills affecting the criminal code, affecting local government, other things that might have expanded upon 1738, those are all still in committee. So what happens in this regulatory process, some of it, the legislature could end up overriding some future date. So just so everybody's kind of ready that we're probably in for a somewhat unsettled period for possibly the next 2 years. Now, the Marijuana Control Board, and again, this is a news item, but I'll just mention it. They were officially appointed July 1st and had their first meeting on July 2nd, and congratulations to Bruce as the chairman. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Very good. Any questions from Mr. Trainee?
So if the regulatory board does something that the state decides to override, is that just a simple majority, or do they have to go higher than just a majority?
The state legislature?
Yeah.
No, through the chair, it would be a simple majority vote because generally, well, statutory law is always of higher precedence than regulatory law. And basically, ballot measure 2, which is codified as 17.38 now, in so many words said there will be a marijuana control board and they will establish regulations, and then gave somewhat broad parameters as to what to do. For the most part, they're copying existing alcohol regulations. You might remember one of the things that we expressed concern about in our written comments last time was the fact that they set up a whole local option system, or they're attempting to by regulation, something that in the world of alcohol was set up only by the legislature, by statute. Some of us, and we mentioned this in our comments, and other municipal lawyers commented on this, are of the opinion that in that case, the board is reaching too far. The legislature may agree with that in other areas and say, you've gone beyond what we expected or what we wanted, but by the same token, the legislature can't undo what ballot measure 2 did. So there's a lot of things that are going to have to be weighed here, and at some point, there could even be litigation on, did the Marijuana Control Board go too far in the regulations that they've set.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anyone else? Anything else, Todd?
No.
Okay, we'll get back to you shortly. Erica, you're going to dominate most of this conversation, so I'm going to jump over and give Amanda a quick moment to comment in regards to the clerk's office. I'm not sure a whole lot's happening there just yet.
Thank you through the chair. The clerk's office continues to review licensing, looking mostly at models from Colorado. Boulder, I think, is one that we've highlighted as wanting to spend more time reviewing that. And I think ideally in the next couple of weeks, we're going to set aside some time to work closely with Erica and the planning department and get a sense of what's licensing and what's land use, and make sure that as we move forward, we're addressing those issues separately.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the coordinated.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we're going to move into the crux of the meeting, and Ms. McConnell invited Ms. Walsh to join us today because she says she is the expert on land use permits, conditional use. And what I'd really like to try to have a discussion about today is we're trying to get our minds around how we handle this influx of all of these licenses at one time. And whether we want to do the land use or the conditional use, which is the easier process, which one moves more quickly, and the public opportunity to be involved in decision-making in regards to both of those processes. Because if we happen to decide that the best way for us is if we make it available, say, beginning in November, we need to know the length of time required in processing either land use or a conditional use, so we get an idea on building a calendar and making a decision. Do we want to do that in front of them applying for a state license, so that if they do get a license and they've already done the work here and it's going to move more quickly for us when they arrive in May? Or if we do it afterwards, then there probably will be a 90-day process with the state, and then there could be another 90 to 120 when it gets into Anchorage. So just feedback from whichever one of you want to field that one in exactly what I would appreciate if you actually walk through it. Bill is coming in and he's going to apply for a land use or a conditional use. What does he have to do?
Okay, well, let's kind of clarify who's responsible for what. Conditional use applications do come through Erica's department, through planning, which is a sister division of development services. Now, when it's really, ready to hit the road, you're ready to build a structure, develop a piece of property, and start doing construction, then you come in for your permit to do that work according to code. So do you want us to talk about conditional use first?
So, sure, and just to add on that, in the old code, the land use permit is basically a building permit outside of the building safety service area. So the land use permit doesn't they don't do a review or an inspection of building code issues, because that's only within the building safety service area. They only look at zoning issues, just zoning, right?
Pretty much.
And on site, maybe.
Yeah.
You want me to? So maybe you should start.
Okay, so that came up right away. Building safety service area, and you have this map. I printed out in grayscale to save the taxpayers money, but you can see the color one on the website. You go to community development or departments, community development, development services, building safety, and then this will be here. And the building safety service area, and that's a whole other conversation, but it is essentially a part of town that where building codes are enforced. Building code applies across the municipality from Eklutna to Portage, but in the building safety service area is where you have a plan review of your proposed construction, and you have inspectors who come to check the inspection at different stages of the work. It roughly follows, and we don't have time to go into it all today, but it roughly follows the boundaries of the original city of Anchorage. And it has to do with when there was unification and outlying areas not wanting to tax themselves for that, type of work. There's not a taxation piece to it anymore, but that's how it's established at this point. So, building safety service area.
Mm-hmm.
If you're outside of that area, so if you're in Eklutna, Indian, Birchwood, Portage, and you want to build a house, you would come to the building department and ask for a land use permit application, which is essentially a very streamlined building permit application. And what the staff would be looking for is it in the right type of zoning? Are you in a place where zoning allows you to build a house? Is your structure going to meet the other provisions of Title 21 in terms of having proper setbacks from the side of the lot that you're on? Are you connecting to sewer and water? Are you having an on-site system? All those kinds of things. So that's the basic placement of the structure and making sure you're meeting all the zoning requirements. Once you get to inside the structure, we expect you, it's an honor system basically, to build it according to the building codes, adopt the building codes, but we don't we don't do a plan review, and we don't send inspectors out there. Having said that, there are entities that may. If you're financing your home, your bank may require you to hire a private plan reviewer or a private inspector and present some kind of certification that things are built according to code. Inside the building safety service area, things get a little bit more detailed. So this next sheet you have, land use plan review, kind of describes what I just said. This is what happens if you're in for land use permit. If you are inside the building safety service area with your proposed development, then you would want to check 2310-104, and this talks about when a permit is required in the building safety service area. And I'll waive reading to use assembly terms, but basically the main thing is we're going to build, enlarge, alter, repair, move, demolish, or this is key, change the occupancy of a building or structure or a piece of it to do something different with it, whether it's electrical, mechanical, gas, or you're changing the use. And I think that's what you want to think about, the term change of use, because that will trigger a building permit. So, for example, let's say I see a little space in a mall on 36th Avenue, and right now it's being used, it used to be a watch store, and I want to go and make it a bakery, and I'm going to bake edibles, maybe. Well, that's a change of use, whether it's a marijuana use or you're baking donuts. It's a change of use. You're changing it from basic retail to something that has a different occupancy. When we say occupancy, we don't mean how many people, although that could go with it. We mean what's happening inside that space. So that would trigger a building permit. Now, once you're in that arena, then it's just standard building codes. It just depends on what you're going to do. If you're going to increase the electrical demand, you would, have to get an electrical permit. If you're going to change walls or change exits or have some kind of use where you'd have enough people, you need, certain numbers of bathrooms, then all that kind of stuff is already in the code, and it really doesn't matter what you're selling. It matters, how.
Okay. Digging a little deeper into it, this is either going to be a liquor store or a marijuana operation. When we have a liquor license come into the community and they're going to go into that little strip mall and do a liquor store, there is a process that's required that goes through the community council, that the community council has a chance for input into whether that permit is issued or not. Try to give them an understanding of exactly how that part of it works.
Well, that's really more in Erica's bailiwick, but I will add on, we do have an inspector who goes at the end of when the store says they're ready to open and they have fulfilled other conditions that Erica's asked. They go to verify, parking spots and things like that before that's approved. So we do have a bit of inspection. And maybe before we turn it back over to Erica, I also provided what's exempt from a building permit. And these are all from code. You can all find them in the website. And then, so that's kind of interesting to know. And if you were going to build a new building, this would be your permit requirements. That's what would be in an application, what you would need, kinds of drawings you would have to provide, all that kind of stuff. So this is like when you get to that point, this is the kind of stuff you have to bring to the counter and start your application. Let's see. The only other caveat I'd like to mention is that Title 23, which is the building codes and the local amendments, is about to be amended to adopt the 2012 building codes, which sounds funny since we're in 2015, but that's a normal 3-year lag from when the codes are first promulgated nationally to when we end up with them. That's illegal right now. It's not completed yet. It's completed. It's illegal for kind of the final review. There are a few changes we may still make, and that will come to the Assembly for approval, and there'll be an opportunity for the public to look at it. So there is some opportunity if through this process you would want to address some of the nuances. We do have opportunity in the cycle we're in right now to still get that done.
Okay.
So before I talk specifically about the alcohol conditional use process, I just want to take a step back and talk about the various land use processes that are in Title 21. So Title 21, which governs land use, says that there are basically 5 different type of approval processes for a land use. The easiest one is what we call a permitted use, and if the code says that a certain use is a permitted use in a certain district, and an easy one is a single family home in an R1 district, permitted use, you don't have to deal with the planning department at all. You go straight over to Sharon's department, division, whatever, and you apply for your building permit or your land use permit, depending on whether you're in the building safety service area. There is no public notice associated. I mean, you do have to post your permit on the property, but other than that, there's no public input into that process. That's the easiest thing. And then the other options are the administrative site plan review, the public hearing site plan review before the Urban Design Commission, the conditional use process before the Planning and Zoning Commission, or the alcohol conditional use process that comes to the assembly. So those are the kind of 5 options that exist for approving a marijuana establishment. Although, of course, we could create a 6th option if we wanted to.
Okay, when we are dealing with marijuana, where is that going to fall in the 5?
Well, ultimately, this will be your decision. But the draft that I've started and will hand out and discuss as soon as we finish this conversation tries to model it like alcohol. So it assumes, well, it creates a process. So in the new code, alcohol is called, we don't call it a conditional use anymore because conditional uses generally, they go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So we call it a special land use permit for alcohol. And so what I've created is a special land use permit for marijuana that goes to the assembly and is approved by resolution, the same way that the non-beer and wine alcohol licenses go to the assembly. Now, in the use table in Chapter 5, where it says what types of uses have what type of approval processes, you could say, you could get, you could differentiate. You could say, well, if it's a store, we want all stores to come to the assembly, but a testing facility, we're not so concerned about that. So we're going to say that's a by right use. Anybody can establish a testing facility just by going to the building department and getting a building permit. Or you could say a testing facility needs to have a conditional use permit from the Planning and Zoning Commission, but we, the assembly, don't need to see it. So you really have the ability to kind of get very specific about which types of establishments go through which approval process in which districts. You can also say that in industrial districts, certain things are easier to do than they are to do in commercial districts. So those types of decisions will be yours. We will, I've drafted some stuff, but I'm not really even sure I'm ready to call it a recommendation because it's very preliminary, but at some point we'll be able to give you a recommendation.
Right. In all of the zoning, industrial, what activities will be allowed in which, because at this point in time, we have nothing that's designated for marijuana use.
Correct.
Any questions from the committee?
No, I have a comment though. So anytime we start talking about the BSA, you will notice every member from Eagle River perk up. And it's because I built a house in Chuyak. And through that process, we did have to have multiple inspections because we had a bank loan. So it's not like we're building, ridiculous houses that aren't safe out there. That I don't want anybody to think that just because you're outside the BSA, it's a bad thing. And the other thing, a comment I'll make is a majority of the industrial lands that we have available, I know, are in Birchwood, which is outside of the BSA. So we have industrial lands out there. And from my perspective, in my community, one thing we will definitely want, one thing I will advocate for, and I'll just put it right now, is this is going to have to be a very public process with maximum participation on the public's part. So I think whatever the process is, I think it will have to be something that comes before the assembly for final approval. And that's my starting point, just so everybody is very clear. But I think this can be done in a very logical and systematic fashion. And I have faith Erica's going to come up with a good process, something we'll have to, discuss really robustly.
Right. What I'm trying to get at, and I see the looks on faces here, you still don't know what you're going to need to do to be able to get this. If we as a body, with liquor license, we do conditional use. And in doing that over a period of time, we've kind of created this morass that's out there where this applies to this store, it doesn't apply to that store, and it may be in this district and not in that district. if we as a body come up with the idea about these are the conditions that we would like to see put on a marijuana retail store, what can we do to expedite the process? Because as Ms. Demboski has already said, we've got to have that public meeting. In most instances, that's going to be a community council in an area where an individual wants to locate a retail outlet. I mean, I think we're going to be dealing more with retail. We're pretty much, I think, majority of the consensus is grow operations will be industrial, processing would probably be, but the retail. So most of these people are going to be finding a location. I'm going to use, I'm still using 2510. I have no idea what's at 2510 C Street, but they've got a location at 2510 that they think would be the perfect retail outlet for this. They're ready to apply for their land use, conditional use for marijuana in that location. How would we do that, and how long is it going to take from beginning, actually making the application, till it goes through the process and comes before the assembly for approval? And I will let both of you know that if you're not prepared to answer that right now, that's okay. Because what we're really looking for is this is part of building that calendar that you've already got going, and we need to be at this point by this time and here. Because if we are going to look at, and personally, it would make sense to me, but the 11 of us will make a decision. If there's a way for us to get part of our process out of the way prior to the actual licensing, then maybe that would keep us from being absolutely buried in May when all of a sudden it's just all over us. So,
Well, the question is challenging to answer because, again, it'll depend on the approval process that the assembly decides is appropriate for each particular
Right.
type of use. So, Amanda and I can talk a little bit about how the liquor license approval process works right now. It's my understanding that as soon as somebody has applied to the state for a license, and of course they have to have a location selected for a state liquor license, they can immediately come to the city, or no, the state lets the clerk's office know that there's been an application.
The state has 10 days to submit that application to our clerk's office for processing as the local governing body.
And then we have 60 days to protest or not protest. So generally the assembly, so the clerk's office then sends that out to a bunch of different departments: planning, building, fire, treasury, DHHS, and says, do you protest or not protest? And the criteria for each of those departments is a little different, but for planning, we look and see whether they have a land use approval. And if they don't have a land use approval, we say we protest. So let's just go with that scenario, we protest. So the clerk's office brings a resolution to the assembly that says, we protest the issuance of this liquor license for the following reasons, but once these issues are resolved, the municipal clerk has the authority to administratively lift the protest. So it doesn't have to come back to the assembly. So then the applicant comes to the planning department and they submit an application for, we're going to say it's a bar. They submit an application for a liquor conditional use, which again we're calling special land use permits for alcohol in the new code. And the application includes the application that they've submitted to the state, a little bit more information. And I'd have to look up in the code what the exact, we have a timeline for which we have to get it to you, to the assembly for looking at it. And I think it's 60 days, but I have to check on that. So we do a review, we create a staff report. For certain types of uses, including bars, we have to tell you how many other liquor licenses there are within 1,000 feet of that particular use. Is it within 200 feet of a church or a school? And we schedule this, and we draft a resolution that is for approval with a variety of conditions that are generally pretty standard conditions. we don't have any special standards for alcohol in the code, and so we tend to be pretty conservative about, just offering new special conditions. Generally, those are initiated by assembly members. So we put it into PACE, it gets scheduled, it's a resolution, so it doesn't have to have a separate introduction and then a later hearing. It can all be done on a single night. And it's a public hearing. And you guys look at it, you hold the public hearing, you decide or not decide. You say you approve it, so you've approved the land use approval for that bar. And if the planning land use approval was the only thing that was holding up if it was the only reason that the municipality was protesting the issuance of the license, then as soon as the assembly approves the land use approval, the clerk goes back to the state and says, our protest is lifted because we've accomplished all the things that we're required to accomplish, and you can go ahead and issue the license to that applicant to open their bar.
So one thing that's different with marijuana than with liquor licensing is that we have the opportunity to have a municipal marijuana license. So I think one thing that I've seen with liquor licensing in the past is the assembly has concerns, and so they're putting conditions on the conditional use permit that maybe don't directly deal with the specific land use. But if the municipality of Anchorage chooses to go in an option of having a municipal license in addition to the state license and also land use issues, then maybe we're able to address some of the concerns that are outside of land use, and that might be things like limiting products for sale, limiting pricing and stuff like that, and things that aren't specific to the land use where that might be more signage or hours. So I think that there's an opportunity to have a little bit more municipal control by recognizing that you might be able to address some of those concerns through licensing. And that's one thing that the city of Boulder has been really successful with in Colorado, is they were able to take their concerns and address them through licensing.
Mr. Trini.
Amanda, have you talked to Boulder on the cost of the municipal license down there?
I made some contacts with Boulder while we were in Colorado, but I haven't specifically spoke to them on that, but I would be happy to get in
I would like
touch
you to
with
do
Boulder
that, because
about
I want to know what a good cost is, and then I want to figure out the workload of the clerk's office. So in case you have to increase your staff,
Okay.
because usually the cost of a license covers increased staff, and I want to make sure you've got that segment covered now.
Be happy to do that.
Ms. Stemboski.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. This is an interesting opportunity with creating a license, because one of the things we see with conditional use permits with alcohol, one of the biggest challenges is when you have a bad operator trying to pull that back. And if a requirement for operating a marijuana business, and I mean, we could learn from the alcohol problems that are created, essentially. So I think this is an interesting opportunity for us to be able to deal with that problem. And Amanda shaking, you're both going, yep.
I think we've learned a lot, especially over the last couple of years, and it's exciting to be able to address concerns we've had in the past in a new process.
Right, and it's exciting to see the mistakes and some of the challenges we are learning from alcohol or permitting and how that works, and apply it now to this new industry. So it'll be interesting. We'll have to follow back up on that one, but because I'm sure there's ways that we could craft it in order to, we want to make sure we have good operators. I don't care what industry you're in, and if this is an opportunity for the assembly to create a little bit more accountability that we haven't had with some alcohol operators, I think this is a good thing.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm a little worried about the timeline. We are not going to be, according to the state schedule, be able to accept applications for permits until February, if I'm not mistaken. And retail operations are scheduled to go live in May, so that gives us approximately 3 months. So the 60-day comment period from some of the departments is probably going to have to be maybe shortened a little bit, or I don't see how we can meet the deadline myself.
Well, the draft of the state, set 2 of the state regulations sets up a process that's very similar to the alcohol process, where it says that the municipality can protest the issuance of a marijuana license. And so we don't, the clerk's office has 60 days to respond to the ABC board about whether or not the ABC board can issue a license, and we kind of extend that to get through our conditional use process by saying we protest, and then later on saying, okay, we're done protesting now, it's okay. So that gives us, or we take more time to review those. I do think, Mr. Hall, what you brought up at the very beginning about what you do first is a very interesting question that deserves a lot of discussion, because, right now, you could apply for your state liquor license, but not get your conditional use, and then you can't have your establishment. So we could have marijuana work the same way, that you get your state, or you at least apply for your state license, and then you can also apply for your municipal license and land use approval. But if you fail any one of those 3, you don't get your license to operate.
Ms. Waltz?
I'd also add in, we have had occasions where a person simultaneously applies for their building permit on the, to refurbish the area or whatever they plan to sell out of, with the understanding that, the conditional use is still pending. Now, we have allowed that because we want to keep businesses moving forward, but it has also been a problem. I can think of one especially having to do with the conditional use for the substation up in your area, and we approved it at the person's own risk, understanding that conditional use wasn't
Right.
the utility's own risk, and it was not awarded. So they spent some money, and it was a problem. So they're very cautious about allowing that. So something to think about as you put the process together.
Mr. Hall, I'll just tack on to that, because you hit on a very important point. When we're talking specifically about that substation, whatever you issue something like that, even though it says stamped in big red letters, proceed at your own risk, somebody invests $100,000, $200,000, maybe $4 million into a project, and then through the community meetings and planning and zoning and all these other things that have to happen, they're denied. There's this sense of, well, I had the permit, and it almost puts you really in a pickle, as far as there's a lot of pressure put on you, as far as and I say you, meaning the community, meaning the body that's deciding that, well, we've invested all this money, you kind of have to approve it, and obviously that didn't happen in that case, but I could see that being a potential, and being because people think, you get a permit, even if it says that in big, bold letters, we all hear what we want to hear, so I think that could be a potential issue.
Mr. Chair, if I could, and just to say, there's a balance for the department, there's the pressure, don't delay reviews, they're too long, get this stuff turned around, get it back out, but yet, here's the, so you put a process in place to kind of help work things along, but then there's this problem on the other end of conditional use, so it's a balance, and the department, looks ultimately the assembly, how do you want us to do it? We can go either way, so.
Okay.
And I think this just highlights something I forgot to mention, that when you go through one of these planning processes, the site plan review, the conditional use, you almost always also need a building or a land use permit. So it's not a one or the other thing.
Right. Anything else? I actually think I got it when you two were chatting. It seems to me that what actually happens is this process is going to go on concurrently. They apply to the state. The state's got 90 days. The state immediately gives notification to our office, our clerk's office, that there's an application for a marijuana license at this location. That starts the operation for the public hearing. The notification is given to community councils that it's here. We have to respond in 60 days or the license gets issued because we didn't protest. But it seems to me that, it sounds to me like it's running concurrent. They apply to the state. State gives you notification that somebody's applied for a marijuana business license at 2510 C Street. You notify the community council in that area. That's where community councils have an opportunity to protest. And then the departments within the municipality. That's why these come to before the body, where here's the license and it will state any protest that's there when we act on them.
But if we head down a dual licensing path, we really
Right.
have an opportunity to simplify the process, because the draft, because I think as we've talked about, if you need both a state license and a municipal license in order to operate, in some sense, the municipality doesn't have skin in the game about whether the state issues a license. We are going to determine about whether the municipality is going to issue a license.
Right.
So we don't have to worry about protesting or not. We can just tell the state, go ahead, issue the license. They can't open until we issue the license, and we're going to go through our process to issue the license. So we can kind of get out of that protesting process if we head down the road of dual licensing, that you must have both licenses to operate, and if either one of them is, revoked or suspended for some reason, you have to stop operating.
And if we do that operation, then we could start our process prior to the state doing theirs.
Sure, good.
Okay.
It's all
Confusion on any of it? Ms. Tucker?
Not confusion, but I want to tie back to what Sharon was talking about, and that would be that the way to avoid, in the example that she gave, they had a building permit so they could actually start building. And so it wasn't a building permit that the first step of putting a footing in the ground was that they had to get the conditional use. And what Erica is talking about is that if you get ahead of the curve here, as you've asked,
Right.
us to really look at, and you issue a municipal license, that municipal license itself will say on its face that it's conditioned on having the city conditional use and the state licensing if you have three-pronged things. Or it could be that to get the municipal licensing, you have to already have the conditional use, but still, on the face of that license, would say, okay, here you're okay, but you still have to pass the state before you get into operation. And that will help mitigate and differentiate the situation here a little bit than what happened in the example that she gave.
Ms. Demboski and then Mr. Trainee.
Mr. Cheney was first.
Mr. Trainee was first?
Just
Mr.
as one
Trainee.
of the assembly members, I want to make sure we've got dual licensing. Because we've seen so many problems, there's the alcohol licensing being done, where the city really does have much of an input into it. Sometimes they say we're arbitrary capricious and non-responsive, so I want to keep it where we've got to go to control our own licenses here, so we can be responsible to our constituents. And I want to make sure there's no secondary market in this license. That if it's gone for some reason, it's gone.
Non-transferable?
You got it.
Yep.
Because otherwise, we get the same problem we've got the taxi cabs and the alcohol industry. The license just increases in cost. I don't want that to be an option.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Demboski.
I agree with Mr. Trainee wholeheartedly. But the other thing I would say is...
We will let that be reflected in the
This is the first time, by the way.
Miracles happen. No, Mr. Trainee's I think, on the right path, but I think also, I'm thinking back to Cynthia Franklin, and when they were talking about the state licensure, and, really, and obviously, Bruce, your board is going to be looking at this, I'm sure, but they were talking about really the high bar that the state is going to set with the licenses that are issued. So obviously somebody who hasn't had a felony, somebody who hasn't been operating illegally, all these different criteria that she was talking about. And I just want to make sure that whatever process that was, I thought what she was saying was rational. I thought it made sense. And if their standard is going to be up here, but then we start issuing licenses and we don't have a comparable standard, I don't want the state necessarily to be lax and be like, well, Anchorage issued it, so we're just going to issue it. Do you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So I guess my point is, I think we have to be very cautious and just issuing licenses to everybody who applies, because we have these 4 basic criteria. I think we really have to think about what Cynthia was talking about last time she was here, and those types of requirements. And it may be beneficial to us if the state standard is really high for us to let them issue the permit, the license first, and not be conditional on us issuing our license. I mean, it might be a thought. Let them do the heavy lifting and let them. I mean, just an idea. I mean, so.
Bruce?
A couple of comments here. With regard to the concurrent licensing process rather than a sequential one, from the perspective of somebody that wants to get into this business, I think the concurrent process is preferable, simply because in both cases somebody's going to have a piece of property committed before they begin the permit or licensing process, which means they're potentially paying several $1,000s a month on a piece of property that they can't use yet. And if the licensing process is sequential, that could be 4, 5, 6 months. So that right there could become a huge hurdle financially to success. That said, I understand the goal, and actually I applaud the fact that we're talking about this now, because we are getting out ahead of this. One concern I have is I practiced architecture for most of 20 years, and I've practiced in communities where they use the local conditional use or permitting process as a means of throttling development. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that's where we're going with this discussion, but there could ultimately be that perception if the licensing process were to get bogged down. There would also be additional overhead, costs associated with that at the administrative level that should rightly be passed on to the industry. I mean, I don't dispute that, but then that just adds more cost and again speaks to the potential success of the people who want to go into this business. With regard to the dual licensing concept, I would suggest that there are undoubtedly goals and concerns that individual communities might have that differ. Anchorage has their perspective, Fairbanks and Juneau will have theirs. There's a unique opportunity here, though, to have that input reflected in the statewide regulations. So I guess obviously I can't participate in that, but I would encourage every community, in Anchorage in particular, since this is my home, to have that input and hopefully see that meaningful sort of input reflected in the statewide regulations. It could be that we get to a point at the end of November where we're having this discussion again and everybody says, you know what, we don't really need a local license because our concerns have already been addressed at the statewide level. That would be sort of my best hope. I don't know if we'll get there, but
I'm not thinking so.
Well, we
Maybe usually they do with alcohol.
Yeah, that's
It happened.
See, and that's the great part
agreed.
about this discussion.
I don't know, but it's an appropriate discussion, and maybe at the very least, maybe we get to the point where that local licensing component is a relatively minor one because the heavy lifting has been done in the state licensing process.
I think those are great comments, Bruce. I really do, and I think
and no pressure, just get it done, Bruce.
yeah, just get it done. I think from our perspective, what you're seeing is because of the years of conditional use alcohol issues that we've dealt with, you're seeing this body with an issue so important. I think you'll see many members not willing to see their power and their authority to the state.
Oh, no,
I mean, that's
fair.
fundamentally where I'm coming from.
Sure. No, that's perfectly fair. May I make one other comment?
Absolutely.
I sitting here, listening to all the discussion about conditional use and permitting processes and so forth, and I kind of have two hats here. I obviously I want to be involved with this industry at some level. I also did practice architecture for a long, long time, and for folks who are watching this process and think that maybe this is going overboard because it's marijuana, it's not. This is normal. Like if I wanted to build a dog grooming parlor, I'd have to go through the same process. So I just wanted to reassure folks that this isn't because we're talking about marijuana.
No, not at all.
I'm not going to open a dog grooming parlor.
Anything else? It appears to me that our priority at this point, number one, should be zoning. They need to know that is a eligible use in that area. So, and you're already working on that one.
So I have something to pass out and walk through it, if you're ready. Okay.
Sure.
Before you do that, I just want to say a couple things before people start reading.
Mhm.
So it's not finished.
Mhm.
It's by no means finished. it's.
That means this is draft. This
Yeah,
is a
it says
draft
over it,
copy.
But it's not, yeah, it's not finished. I would say it sets up a framework for how to amend Title 21. And I would say that the framework is a basic recommendation, but the content, the specifics, I'm not ready to say that this is what the planning department is recommending for several reasons. One is the fact that my boss has not looked at it. But the things that are in there came from things that I've heard that this committee has discussed and opinions expressed, from reviews of some of the Colorado municipal codes that we've looked at, and discussions with our staff working group that we've done. But definitely this is a discussion draft, and I'm not ready to say this is what we think you should definitely do. Nobody else has seen this because I was still working on it at 3 o'clock today. So, law hasn't seen it, clerks haven't seen it, nobody's seen it. It's got a lot of concepts. I'm sure there's wording that can be improved. I'm sure law will say, oh no, you can't say it this way, you have to say it some other way. It is set up similar to the alcohol licensing process in which you start with the state, but if that can totally be changed, but that's kind of how it started. So,
I think every lawyer in the room just cringed. What do you mean we haven't seen it?
Thanks. Well, obviously, we're not going to take time to read this, so any comments that you want to share with us?
can I just walk through it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it proposes to set up a special land use permit for marijuana in the same way we have a special land use permit for alcohol, and it gives the authority to issue that to the assembly. So the section 1 is an amendment to chapter 2 that says the decision-making responsibility for the special permit lies with the assembly. The next section is just adding that into the assembly's powers and duties in chapter 2 of the new code. Section 3 is about community meetings. We had talked at the Title 21 committee yesterday about having a community meeting for marijuana. So I added it in there for the special land use permit for marijuana. Maybe we want to do that, maybe we don't, but I put it in. And then notice requirements, that notice when this type of application is processed would have to be mailed to property owners and residents within 500 feet, published on the municipal notice page, posted on the site, and sent to the community council. And backing up, please remember that the community meeting is intended to be a community council meeting when possible. But even if it isn't held with the community council meeting, the community council is still given notice through the official notice. The next section does set up a process for the special land use permit for marijuana. It indicates that an application can be initiated by the property owner or by someone who has a letter of authorization from the property owner, community meeting, application submittal. It says after you've applied to the state and concurrent with an application for a license, but again, that can be changed. Public notice is required. The department would review and do a report to the assembly. And I added in similar to alcohol, we would provide a list of all marijuana licenses within 1,000 feet. Maybe you like that, maybe you don't care. And then the assembly would take action based on approval criteria, which is not yet drafted. And then I pulled effective denial and some expiration language from our alcohol process, that if you are denied, you can't apply with a substantially similar application for at least 1 year. And then at what time, how would this land use approval expire? So there's still some work to be done in those sections. And then how to modify it. Yeah.
Is there a way for someone to appeal if they're denied?
Well, it's always been my understanding that to appeal a decision of the assembly would be to sue the assembly, but perhaps the lawyers in the room.
Just throwing it out.
Julia can answer that.
Well, it's different for other land use items, that are not alcohol and not marijuana, that are issued at the local level, then it goes from the planning and zoning and from the Board of Adjustment to Superior Court. When the assembly sits on alcohol and files a protest, then there is a administrative process that takes place over on the state side. I mean, the municipality is in that now with Spirits in Alaska, and it goes to an administrative hearing officer that's hired by the state to hear that process. So part of it is going to depend on this system because as Erica said, this is the conditional use delegated to the assembly within the frame structure, much like you have with alcohol. Were you to do what they've also talked about, the local license, then other municipal licenses have an appeal process here. And again, as Eric has talked about, if the final decision maker is the assembly, then that's the final decision of the city, and the appeal goes to Superior Court.
Thanks.
Sure. So the next section adds, so if you look at the very last page, you'll see a piece of the table of allowed uses. And this sets out 4 types of commercial marijuana uses, and these are consistent with the 4 types that are listed in Section 2 of the regulations. You have your cultivation facility, your manufacturing facility, your testing facility, and your retail sales establishment. And so this is where the rubber's going to hit the road. What district is it allowed in, and what is the approval process? So I've created a new abbreviation, which is the letter T. Unfortunately, M for marijuana is already used by major site plan review, and P for permit is already used by permitted use, and S for special is already used by site plan review, so I didn't really know what letter to pick. So I picked T for permit, T at the end, but it could be J, or do whatever you want. Yeah, that would work too. So
You say MJ? That is so funny.
I said THC.
So this is where, so say you wanted to say that cultivation facilities were permitted in the industrial districts without assembly approval, but they needed assembly approval to go in a commercial district. Well, you could put a P under the I-1 and the I-2, but a T under the B3. So and so the T indicates coming to the assembly for the special land use permit for marijuana. You could set it up that everything, no matter what it is, has to come to the assembly, and then everything would say T, or you could set it up differently. But the process that we're talking about coming to the assembly would only happen when you use the letter T in this table.
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Mr. Bosky.
Thank you. I think in our Title 21 committee meeting this week, this is, I think, part of the reason there's so much emphasis put on the land use plan map, because we have to understand where these districts are, where the land is available, and then we make the determination where it's appropriate to put these types of establishments. So all this ties really nicely into what we're working on right now. And you didn't see it, Erica, but I sent out the agenda this morning to the clerk to distribute, and you're on there for update us where we're at with marijuana.
Okay.
So for Wednesday, you're right on the agenda. But this is one of those things, Mr. Hall, why I think we were having a discussion, why it's so important. We have to figure out the zoning, and we have to figure out the allowable uses in what areas. Sorry.
So going back to page 4, page 6, this amends the list, the abbreviation description before the table to say, okay, we know what P and S and M and C mean. Well, here now we're adding, here's what T means. So if there's a T in the table, this is what it means. The next section references the table, which is Exhibit A. And the section after that is in Chapter 5, and it lists the types of marijuana establishments that you could have, and it has starts with use-specific standards applicable to all marijuana establishments, and then it has each particular establishment, it defines it, and it has any use-specific standards. And this is also a section that's not really finished. Something I want to talk to legal about is I've proposed definitions that are not, I didn't just reference the state definitions, and there were reasons why I did that, but that may not be the recommendation of the legal department, so that'd be something I want to talk to them about. And I put some questions in the comments, or some, there were some things that I took from the proposed state regulations, but there were some questions I had about what certain things meant in the state regulations, so I'll definitely be making sure that the municipal comments on the state regulations include my questions about, I don't know what it means when you say outer boundary of something. So moving on to page 10, this sets the off-street parking requirements for marijuana establishments. I just took a wild guess, so I'll have to talk to the traffic department about what they think is appropriate. The next section makes similar amendments to earlier sections in Chapter 9, the Girdwood Code, and the section after that makes similar amendments to Chapter 10, the Chugach-Eagle River chapter. And then the last section is the definition section, where I stated that marijuana has the same meaning as set forth in Alaska statutes, and marijuana product has the same meaning as set forth in Alaska statutes. And I'll definitely also want to confer with legal about which definitions they think are important to make sure we carry over into Title 21 and which we don't need to. So the schedule that we had discussed earlier did talk about having a draft that we were ready to release kind of for formal public review by the end of this month. I'll be working on this in the next 2 weeks in collaboration with my colleagues. We may miss the end of the month a little bit, but following that, it would be my goal to have kind of some general just public informational meetings and comment meetings in Chugach-Eagle River, in Girdwood, in the Anchorage Bowl, to get feedback on this so that we can potentially propose amendments at the Planning and Zoning Commission level, or at least discuss issues that have been raised by the public. Planning and Zoning, I think we were looking at September, with getting to the assembly in, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was November or December, probably right after budget, so that people had a couple of months before February. And I put an effective date in here that's totally wrong, so you can make fun of that. But so that people had a couple of months before they were starting to submit permits, because as you know, it's a tight timeline, but people do want to make plans and, lock down properties and stuff like that.
Okay. Good work, Eric. Thank you. Julia?
I had a question that, I was triggered by a question that Mr. Trini asked me sidebar, and that is that as alcohol evolved, and the Assembly's review of alcohol permitting, for the last probably 8 years, there's been a piece of alcohol permitting when it came to on-premises wine and beer licenses that were handled and could be handled initially at the administrative level. And in thinking about what Ernie's been talking about in terms of getting a wide, getting an influx of applications, is there any room in your conceptual thinking about having something done at the administrative level for any segment of the marijuana situation before it gets to the assembly?
Well, beer wine doesn't go, it's approved administratively, and it doesn't go to the assembly
Right.
unless there's an appeal.
Right.
So that would be something that could be handled through how this table is filled out. So if there's something that the assembly felt that could be approved by the director and didn't need didn't need to go to the assembly for approval, it could be done through an administrative site plan review through an S.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they felt like it really didn't need a land use review at all, they could have a P and just, they would head straight over
But I guess
to.
my question to you was there anything that popped out that might be comparable to that in your conceptual thinking and, or is it mostly so new that, you know, that like the beer and wine licenses, it'll have to come about, you know, with time?
So, to me, it doesn't seem like marijuana is comparable to alcohol in terms of having these very clear distinctions between kind of hard liquor and beer and wine. And beer and wine served at a restaurant where the limitation is 50% of your receipts have to come from food. So, you know, those are the things that are, and having this long history of, you know, those things were never problematic, never denied, so couldn't they be done administratively? So I would say both from a comparison concept and from the not having a long history of this type of establishment hasn't ever really been problematic. I would not say that at this point I've identified any kind of store. I mean, if you compare the,
I understand. That's good.
Like, uses that purvey alcohol really only compare to retail stores. You don't have, I mean, I guess you have your breweries, which would compare to a cultivation place, and the breweries only need to come to the assembly if they're gonna have a tasting room, because the assembly only looks at retail sale of alcohol. They don't approve manufacturing of alcohol. So at this point, no,
So,
I
yeah,
haven't
it is a-
identified that.
Then if I could, Mr. Chair, I have one question. When, in alcohol, when the conditional use comes directly to the assembly for the assembly's first shot and initial shot at looking at it, my experience has been that it comes to the assembly with the benefit of a staff report. And so the staff has evaluated it and makes some recommendations. Is there any room in there, or how difficult would it be should the assembly want to think about doing something a little bit differently, is to have it come not just with a staff report, but with some sort of actual more defined, if not an administrative decision, but sort of like zoning, like the actual zoning things are done, where they give the benefit of advice from P&Z, but there's more limitation on how to do this. So there's been a real substantive screening, and not just the staff report before it gets to the assembly.
Substantive screening by who?
By staff.
I mean, I think the problem with alcohol is that we don't really have any specific standards, and so we're looking at very general, broad standards. You know, does this, you know, how does this impact the health, safety, and welfare of the community? Well, depending on what reports you look at, you could say we should never approve any more alcohol establishments, or you could say we have tons of them, what is one more going to do? So if we drill down and actually create some specific approval criteria for marijuana establishments, I think the staff recommendation can actually be more useful to the assembly, because the criteria that we would be evaluating the process against would be more targeted to this type of establishment, which is a sidebar way of saying we really should create new alcohol criteria.
Right,
but maybe in a couple of years.
Oh, we feel the same way.
But your concept of this would be that there would be more specific criteria.
Yes, on page 5 of 14, there's a section for approval criteria that is going at this time.
But that would be your recommendation. I mean, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that in order for this, that you would envision a staff report would come to the assembly if the assembly had approval, for the same reasons that a staff report goes to the assembly for alcohol now, and that one area of making that staff report more meaningful to the assembly would be to make sure that the criteria that the assembly is asking staff to review the application under is more concrete than what we have in alcohol. And I agree with that. I think that that's really something.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, and I think that's an excellent point, Julia. If the staff were to review these applications and we knew that they had reviewed them in detail, then we probably would not have to, and you gave a recommendation for a permit to someone, we may not have to spend quite as much time at the assembly level reviewing each permit, especially since it looks like we may be getting several of them at once.
Okay. Any other comments? Mr. Schulte?
I've actually been sitting here forming a question, and you kind of halfway answered it, so I'll try and make it more succinct. Looking at your some of these tables, like the parking requirements and the zoning assignments, I guess one question I had was what analogous businesses were you comparing them to? Like, a grow operation compares to what kind of other business, and a retail store compares to what other kind of business. I think that would be super helpful for everybody to understand that comparison.
For the retail, for the parking, particularly for the retail sales, I just looked at other retail, general retail, and that using the same parking ratio there. For testing facility, I looked at a research laboratory and the the parking ratio we have for a research laboratory. But there could definitely be more, probably checking with other communities about that, about how big they tend to be, how many employees they tend to have, because I don't know. And for a manufacturing facility, I was looking at our general manufacturing uses. But again, I think there could be more research there. For a cultivation facility, I really have no idea, so it's blank at this time.
If I may just expand on that, that seems perfectly reasonable. And based on the prior discussion too, it might be helpful to everybody involved, not just the assembly, but potential business owners to set out, what are the expectations, what are the guidelines, what are the concerns. If looking at this, if odor control is an issue for a cultivation facility, then what are the parameters and what are the basis for those concerns? I think that would help everyone arrive at a fairly succinct checklist of items, so that it is less arbitrary and more scripted, not scripted, but a little bit more objective, I guess, in its execution.
Very good. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so just to follow up on those comments, if someone had a greenhouse in right now in Anchorage, what is that area? What zoning is required?
Like
for
a
that?
commercial greenhouse?
Yeah.
I forgot to bring my code with me, but that would be considered commercial horticulture, and it's in the table in chapter 5, and it would say it's allowed in these districts by, whatever process. I don't have it off the top of my head, but.
Well, and I would, just to follow up on that, Mr. Chairman, I would think that if we're going to have marijuana cultivation facilities, they should be able to be available in areas where greenhouses are currently permitted. And so I didn't know if that was where that would be on the scale here, but.
I didn't use that I didn't model it after that, partly because the things that I've heard have been about making sure that basically marijuana is not visible, so it tends to be more in warehouse structures than in like the kind of greenhouses that are made of glass or have visqueen or whatever.
Right.
And in other communities, it has been more of an industrial use. And so I think there are certain residential districts where you can have a greenhouse business. And it was my assumption that, one would not really want to see warehouses in residential districts. But again, you guys will be the final arbiters of that.
Thank you.
Mr. Falls?
Chair, just a quick question, Erica. Does this draft contemplate facilities that may straddle some of these definitions, that could be both cultivation facility with some on-site manufacturing, with some on-site testing, and maybe even a retail storefront?
You would have to get, this draft was contemplated, you'd have to get licenses for each one of those uses. And it may be useful to specify which kinds of things you can combine. I think there's been discussion about, not really having people who have a license I can't remember if it was grow or sell or both, also have a license to do the testing facility, because that would be kind of a conflict of interest. So that could be something that could be specified.
At this point, I want to give the public a chance to comment. We've only got a few minutes left, but if any comments, Mr. Haberman?
My name is Eugene Carl Haven, I represent myself. Follow the public process, to use, monitor it, use by officials when conducting public meetings, meetings are conducted. The process is done appropriately, a decision made by the governing body is more likely in public interest. I should note here, as you know, many of you know, I follow a lot of meetings, particularly Assembly Committee meetings. And I may be mistaken, but on this committee, I know that there's a non-assembly member here that's on the committee. The Ethics Election Committee is assembly members. The Public Safety Committee is assembly members. I can go on. This is the first time, and it may have happened before. We're going to call this an assembly committee meeting. They should be assembly members who were elected and represent the title. And I should also take the person who got on the right question, because he represents the State Control Board, and I witnessed and reviewed the process used for notification, a press release for the State Control Board, July 1, for announcing who's on board, and the next day having a meeting. And they put a notice of meeting before they even had the names of the parties on the Control Board, 2 days before July 4th weekend. Where is a reasonable opportunity for the public to be engaged? And the last part of my statement, because I realize time is returning to it, is that I appreciate the comments made here by the different parties, but engage the public is not putting stuff out at this meeting. Have the information way in advance so people here can digest this. We should see people here going through this thing, and it's not even on the agenda. Quite inappropriate for people to be properly engaged in whatever subject it is. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question for you. You mentioned something about land use can determine the pricing of products. Or were you talking about the pricing of something else and I misunderstood?
I was talking about.
I just want to.
Yeah, now I remember what you're talking about. So, one thing that we have seen with through the chair with the alcohol conditional use is that they're trying to put conditions on it that relate to, and speaking specifically about there's a downtown community council section that limits the cost of wine that can be sold in the downtown area, and
Puts you can't sell below a certain amount.
Yeah.
So you can't sell cheap, like cheap
Okay.
wines.
Okay.
so I apologize for not being more clear.
I just was
So-
wondering if you could elaborate something.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me that opportunity.
Anyone else? I hope that you may have learned something today. We're really trying to help you through that as we're trying to help ourselves through it as well. Next meeting is going to be August 27th. It'll be 4 to 5:30. We are going to make these 90-minute meetings because it's pretty obvious that we got a lot of territory to cover here. With that, Mr. Trainee, you're asked to stay after. I will discuss that later. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.